Hey, welcome back everyone. We're again here broadcasting from my apartment in Queens, New York, continuing our broadcasts 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, on this new coronavirus, this CCP virus. And we have a great interview lined up today with Dr. Sean Lin. You might remember him from the documentary I was heavily featured in, tracking the origin of the Wuhan coronavirus. Dr. Sean Lin is a former lab director of the viral disease branch of the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, U.S. Army, and of course worked in virus studies with the U.S. Army. And he's done some analysis on the data coming out of China on this virus, and shows through the information that actually was provided from these Chinese labs evidence that they are either lying about the research they did or that they have covered up the real date that their research was done. Couple news stories lined up today. One, we're going to be going into how the White House will allegedly be releasing conclusive evidence that this coronavirus originated in a Wuhan laboratory. And we'll also be looking into this rumored report, which Reuters reported on, saying that the Chinese regime may be preparing for war against the United States over its harsh response to this virus. Now, a lot of you have been asking what you can do to stand up to the CCP and also to help this channel. First of all, the Epoch Times has launched a global petition calling for the investigation, rejection, and condemnation of the Chinese Communist Party. You can check it out now. It's at ccpvirustruth.com. If you can, please sign the petition. Let everyone know about it. That's ccpvirustruth.com. And of course, those of you wanting to support the show, we do get demonetized on and off. It's a bit rocky with YouTube. We do accept donations. If you can, please contribute to the channel. If anything, just like and subscribe. Again, it really helps us. Let your friends and family know about this channel as well. First off, we have the White House will release conclusive evidence that this coronavirus originated in the Wuhan lab, according to Trump. He said that his administration will be giving a very strong report on what we think happened, and I think it will be very conclusive. Trump said, quote, "Personally, I think they made a horrible mistake," referring to the Chinese regime. "They didn't want to admit it. We wanted to go in, but they didn't want us there. World Health wanted to go in." In other words, the United States and the World Health Organization notably wanted to send investigators to China to try to figure out where this virus originated. The Chinese regime not only rejected the U.S., but also rejected the WHO's request, and rejected most countries' requests, and is now even threatening countries that continue requesting. Now, Trump continued, quote, "They tried to cover it. They tried to pull it out. It's like trying to put out a fire. They couldn't put out the fire." Again, suggesting that the Chinese regime knew something happened, possibly knew this virus leak took place, which Trump is suggesting that this report will show. He did not suggest that this was intentional. It appears that he's saying this was accidental. The Chinese regime mishandled it, lost control of it. Now, stick around for that. We're going to be giving updates on this as it develops. And there is an alleged report with the Chinese regime that is warning of a backlash on par with the Tiananmen Square massacre in terms of how the Chinese regime's international image is being impacted. And the Chinese regime is allegedly preparing for a possible war. Now, Reuters had the exclusive story on this, and they say it was relayed to them by sources who allegedly had knowledge of this report's findings. This report allegedly was presented last month by the Ministry of State Security, which is kind of like a combination of FBI and CIA for the Chinese regime. And it was presented to top CCP leaders, including Xi Jinping, head of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I'll be giving my analysis on this, so stick around, but I want to go into a bit of what it says first. Now, Reuters reports, quote, "As a result, Beijing faces a wave of anti-China sentiment led by the United States in the aftermath of the pandemic and needs to be prepared in a worst-case scenario for armed confrontation between the two global powers. It is widely believed in Beijing that the United States wants to contain a rising China, which has become more assertive globally as its economy has grown. The paper concludes that Washington views China's rise as an economic and national security threat, and a challenge to Western democracies, the people said, in other words, according to their sources. The report also said the United States was aiming to undercut the ruling Communist Party by undermining public confidence. Personally, to me, this reeks of disinformation, and I'll explain why. Now, the talking points, such as this quote, for example, "It is widely believed in Beijing that the United States wants to contain a rising China, which has become more assertive globally as its economy has grown." This is one of the CCP's talking points. This would not be in a strategic, possibly military document. All the CCP leaders would think this already. This is something they talk about all the time. This would be nothing new, nothing whatsoever. When it says the United States was aiming to undercut the ruling Communist Party by undermining public confidence, this of course goes into the war of words, where the Chinese regime has been very active for very long. Notably, I've mentioned like the three warfares doctrine: psychological warfare, media warfare, legal warfare, dedicated to information war under the Chinese Communist Party's military. Other things like the liaison department, its military branch dedicated to political warfare under the general political department. The Chinese regime has entire military programs dedicated to this stuff. This does not appear to be strategic analysis because it's repeating Chinese regime talking points. Let's look into some of the background on this. I would interpret this as a ploy to try to challenge international criticism of the CCP to make it look like warmongering. Now remember North Korea, ISIS, Iran, when Trump was going very hard against these three different groups, two countries, one group. Pretty much the entire global media apparatus was saying Trump is crazy, he's going to start World War III, so on and so on, right? What happened? North Korea backed off. Of course they're still doing rocket tests. When was the last time they threatened a nuclear war with the world? It's been a long time. What happened with Iran? They're still a bit hostile, but they've cooled down quite a bit. These World War III scenarios risk did not happen, but of course the media used those to try to rile up attacks on the Trump administration. Now look, like or don't like the Trump administration, I'm not going to go into that. I'm merely talking about this from the standpoint of the CCP and its information operations. They're viewing incidents that took place in the past, precedents that have been set, which they can use to frame narratives when launching an attack. If the goal is to try to dissuade the Trump administration during an election year from attacking it, from going hard against it, this is one of the ways it would do so, based on just common information warfare. Now, the Chinese regime has a saying, "Strangle you with your own systems." They look for vulnerabilities in how you operate. What are your cultural weaknesses? Well, racism, political correctness. Notably, a lot of the Chinese information operations going against, say, the arrests of Chinese spies on U.S. soil or Canadian soil often use racism as a line to challenge those things, or discrimination. It's, again, one of our weak points. It's something that can be exploited. Not saying these things aren't real, but for the Chinese regime, this is strategy. And of course, if they want to attack Trump, they can play on that. They give the media a talking point, challenging a hostile regime is, something that can lead to war, which is, of course, what they played on in the past, which is what they could very likely play on now if they so choose. The Chinese regime has given them the ammunition for this. Now, given the threats of warfare, let's look into what they say. It says the Chinese regime needs to be prepared in a worst-case scenario for armed confrontation between the two global powers. The United States, as far as I've seen, has not threatened war against China in any way, although it does appear to be positioning weapon systems in case the Chinese regime tries something aggressive. Now, for the Chinese regime, based on my analysis at least, is that this virus, this international scenario it's facing, all of the investigations and the possible lawsuits, countries pulling their businesses out, and all of this on the heels of the Hong Kong protests, the flip in Taiwan against the party that was supportive of the CCP, and different risks of internal instability from things like unemployment, from things like people being angry at the CCP for its handling of the virus, and so on. It is destabilized in every possible way. What does a tyrannical regime do when its holds on power are threatened, right? Not a whole lot of options. It is possible they might try to start a war. Do I think they'll do that? Personally, I don't think they would, because I don't think they're capable of doing it right now. Some people disagree with me. A researcher I'm good friends with and I have deep respect for, Jeff Nyquist, he and I have had some phone calls about this, and he believes that China will try to launch something. I personally disagree with him, but he has very good analysis. So it does appear the U.S. is positioning systems to prepare for that possible scenario, and I personally believe that those things will dissuade a conflict like that from happening. Namely because the surface Chinese military is not yet in a position where it could fight the U.S. military head-on, which is why they have things like unrestricted warfare, unconventional warfare programs, things like business warfare, culture warfare, drug warfare, economic warfare, targeting GDP of countries. It is ways of targeting the, say, overt systems that make a society function, weaponizing things like foreign direct investment. We know they're doing this. For example, India's, of course, not allowing Chinese foreign direct investment right now. There were intelligence warnings in the UK saying that China would try to exploit that right now, so on. All of these things are being cut off and attacked. When it comes to open conflict, if the Chinese regime were to launch an open war, it would take at least until they're fully developed and capable of fighting, against a country like the United States openly, which they're currently not. It would take the form of what they call the Assassin's Mace program. The Assassin's Mace relies on surprise attack. And right now they don't have the benefit of surprise attack. I don't think this is a possible scenario. Personally, again, is that this report seems to be disinformation. Partly because I don't really think Reuters gets a lot of good leaked information from Chinese sources. I seriously question who these individuals providing the story to Reuters are, and whether these individuals were sent to give them this story. And a brief note on disinformation. It often gets confused with misinformation and propaganda when they're actually very different. Misinformation is the outright statement of false information, and it has strategic uses. For example, a country, if there's a legitimate movement, for example, they might insert false information into that legitimate movement to cause confusion within it, right? To make it appear like it's a conspiracy, to make it appear that they're spreading rumors. That is a strategic method of using misinformation. Provide false information to researchers so that if they do release something, they can come back and say, aha, how could you be credible if you got this thing wrong? Propaganda is not necessarily true or false, something that elicits an emotional response to something. Propaganda could be a poster, something that makes you feel, patriotism. It could be something that makes you feel anger. Propaganda is the manipulation of the emotional process attached to a political issue or a political goal. It has its strategic uses, but different again from disinformation. Disinformation is very mixed. It can be things like fake events. Common term used for is like the Potemkin village. It goes back to this story in feudal Russia where this Tsar allegedly took this queen on this tour, and he set up this false village, this Potemkin village, where she could see what it would look like, once they settled in there. Chinese regime using fake incidents to frame individuals. For example, 2008, Beijing Olympics. There were reports of Chinese police putting on the robes of Tibetan Buddhist monks to cause trouble. Another form of disinformation would be, for example, releasing ports through credible institutions, or apparently credible institutions, which would then, of course, be cited by outlets, trusted outlets within a targeted country. Or it could also be something where the information itself is true, but a false conclusion is drawn from the true information. It can also be sometimes something that is 99% true, but is 1% false. And that 1% falsehood can be latched onto to use strategically once the rest of the 99% of the information has been validated within the country's psyche. Typically, disinformation will manipulate trusted sources within a targeted country. It will not typically be run through the official branches, say, of the propaganda department of the Chinese regime. It'll work through trusted networks like this. Now, that said, let's jump into this interview with Dr. Sean Lin. Now, part of his analysis is based on a paper that was submitted to the journal Nature on January 20 and was published on February 3rd. And the dates are important if you all want to dig into this later. Hey, Sean, it's good to connect with you again.
Yeah, it's wonderful to talk to you again.
Yeah, so I understand you've been doing some analysis on the research at this laboratory, specifically on Xi Zhengli, and you found some interesting stuff suggesting possibly that there's been a cover-up. Can you explain some of your analysis on this?
So as the world is trying to investigate, where did the outbreak started in Wuhan, so it's very important to understand when did the patient sample arrive in a different lab and get tested and to be confirmed to be the SARS-CoV-2, right? So it's very important to understand the timeline when did the hospital provide sample to the institute like Wuhan Institute of Virology and get it sequenced. So the Shi Zhenli's group published a very important article on February 3rd, and it's on the top scientific journal, Nature. So this article is highly cited in the scientific community. So in this article, they mention they have to do the viral isolation, do the full genome sequencing, and also have to characterize the virus, do many serologic tests and receptor bindings. But when I compare it to the open letter from the Wuhan Institute of Virology leadership published on February 17, I found a big conflict. The open letter from the leadership of Wuhan Institute of Virology saying they actually done a very dramatic job. So they said they received the sample from the Wuhan hospital on December 30th. And then in 3 days, by January 2nd, they obtained the full virus genome. And then by January 5th, they obtained the isolated virus for the SARS-CoV-2. So this actually present a huge problem because if you have experience in virology, these timelines is almost impossible. Why? All right, let me explain it. When you got the patient sample from the hospital, so you can do full genome sequencing right for this patient sample. This will be like a random sequencing, right? Because you don't know what viral pathogen in there. So you're doing random sequencing and then do de novo assembly when you obtain a sequence there. And according to the Nature paper, they did not get a full genome at the first trial. So there were gaps in the genome. So Shi Zhenli's group have to use other like Sanger sequencing, other technology to try to fill the gap. So in order to fill the gap, you also have to design primers flanking these gap regions so in order you can sequence in it, right? So these take extra time, and there's no way you can do this full genome sequence, including gap feeding efforts, to do it in 3 days. No, this is impossible. So
how long does that normally take?
Usually at least a week. At least a week, and that even doesn't count your waiting time to obtain the new primer you need to design to flank in the gap regions. So definitely means the Wuhan Institute of Virology or Shi Zhenli's lab, they received the samples much earlier than December 30th. Another problem is about isolating the virus. Isolating virus is a very challenging task because when you obtain the patient sample, of course you can put the patient sample to some of the supernatants from this patient sample. And you put in a cell culture and try to let the virus in the supernatant can infect the cells, right? Grow out the virus, but it's not easy, especially from patient samples. As I see some other report, like in Korean study. It took actually 7 days for them to see a virus, because sometimes at the beginning the virus volumes, or you can say virus titer in this patient samples will be very low, so it's not easy to grow out. Right? Even if it's fast, you have to observe the cell showing cytopathic effect. That means the cells kind of gradually dying, being infected by the virus. The earliest you can see probably 2 or 3 days, you see a little bit cytopathic effect. And you also need to monitor, you need to make sure the cytopathic effect happens. And then you also have to take this supernatant from this first round of infection, right? You have to take the supernatant and then do another round of infection, because you have to make sure something grow out of this cell can really infect.
And so based on the research she did, this Dr. Xi did, how does that conflict with this?
Because they said like from December 30 and then by January 5th, they obtained a full virus isolate. That's only like 6 days. So this is almost impossible too, because even the first round of infection takes up 1 week, even if you non-stop working. And then you have the second round, you need to repeat the infection. And then you also need to titre the virus. You need to know how much virus in that second or third round of infection. And then you need to use this virus to isolate. You need to spin down, purify it, and then reinfect it to confirm. And then also from that viral isolate, you need to do another 4 genome sequencing for this isolated virus to compare to the sequencing from the patient sample directly. So when you isolate the virus, you need to also resequence it and compare it so that you confirm, oh, this is the full virus genome that I got. It's a single strain of the virus. So it takes definitely 3-4 weeks for the whole line of work to get it done.
And you don't think there's any way they could have possibly done it within a week? That's unheard of? Has this ever been done before?
Yeah, it's impossible. It's impossible. Even for the paper to publish it on January 20, that's already amazing. If you think they started from the first outbreak, from the first sample, officially the Wuhan Institute of Virology claimed they received on the December 30, and by January 20 to publish on the Nature, it's almost impossible because you even need 2-3 days to write a paper too, and review too, right? Probably 1 week before the article can be published. So basically, you have 2 weeks to do all these experiments, including characterizing the virus. That's impossible. So it's very likely they probably got this patient sample as early as middle or early December. So they had all the time to run all these experiments. So that's why it all takes time. It is impossible. You 2 weeks, you do all these experiments. So that's why this definitely is a cover-up. The Wuhan Institute of Virology, their leadership covering up, because the scientific paper they don't have to mention the time when they receive the patient sample. But the Wuhan Institute leadership, they are lying. They are supporting the government covering up when did they first know there's an outbreak in Wuhan and when did they receive the patient sample. And the Shi Zhenli's group probably started the work in mid-December.
Well, so I'd say there's two possibilities. One would be, as you mentioned, it does seem that they would have had to have gotten this earlier. If they actually did the research, they would have had to have gotten it much earlier than they claim, which does suggest, that there's a pretty serious cover-up going on. The other possibility is they just, based on previous experience, just threw together a random report. But what do you think the chances of that are in terms of the integrity of the report itself? Do you think the report itself reflects this current virus? Do you think the report is accurate?
Overall, I think the report's quality is good from the different aspect of the sequencing, the isolated virus, and they do different characterization of the virus. That part, I think overall the scientific merit is there. That's why I think the cover-up is in the leadership, in the political section of the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
This could suggest two things. One is, of course, they received a sample from the public, or two, this, of course, as a lot of people are suspecting right now, is a virus that they already had at the laboratory. I suppose this isn't a question we can answer by looking at this data, unfortunately. In terms of looking at these anomalies, though, what else have you seen?
Another aspect need to be further looked in depth is regarding about the back coronavirus strain, the ITG13 that was mentioned in this Nature paper. The Shi Zhenli's group have done research, intensive studies on so many back coronavirus strains. They have hundreds of these strains in their lab they collected from Yunnan province. In her previous scientific publication, there's no mention about this RATG13. And it just suddenly appeared in this Nature paper. So how the Shi Zhenli group screening all their collected virus strain and then obtain this one unique back coronavirus strain that's showing 96% homology with SARS-CoV-2. And this is only one strain. And there's no previous publication about it. It was really strange. And they submitted virus genome sequence to GCEP, one of the largest database for gene sequence for virology. But the virus was collected, it was on 2013 July. So this is almost 7 years delay. Right? So So why? You know this virus collected in such a long time. There's no previous study, and suddenly, how did you know this one need to be further investigated and need to compare to the SARS-CoV-2? So this one is really strange. And then this group resubmit this virus genome sequence to the gene bank as late as in March, late March. So what happened between January and March? So we don't know. That's why I think this strain is really surprising. So I think because this is the only bad coronavirus strain that's showing such high homology to SARS-CoV-2, even higher homology to the Pangolin coronavirus. So when did this virus strain come from? Right? Any records? How was this virus was collected? And there was no follow-up report. Because if you think this is a very important source, right, you can check when was the virus collected and what's a unique location in any particular cave, right? So this is all very important because maybe this is the only bad coronavirus strain showing such high homology to SARS-CoV. So it definitely need more investigation, but we haven't seen any report.
And so, in other words, they had this one bat coronavirus. It's 96% homology, as you mentioned.
Yes.
Would this be the Yunnan bat virus?
Yeah, but so many caves. Right? When did you collect it? Where did you collect exactly in Yunnan? It's important because there are so many different species.
You know, Xi Zhengli, she's like, she's called the Bat Woman of China. She was traveling all around the world collecting bat coronaviruses. And, they would have had, I assume, thousands of viruses at that laboratory. How would they know to immediately look at that one specific bat virus as being the, potential connection with this? If there was only one paper ever written on it, it seems to have been something they looked at and then put on the shelf, essentially. Is this what you're suggesting?
It's really surprising to see it. And then when I read the Nature paper thoroughly, I was looking for any explanation, like mentioning they screening many of the bad coronavirus strain, and then they found one showing high homology, right? But even in this paper, there's no mention about it. They didn't mention they do any screening of their collected bad coronavirus pool. There's no such efforts being described in the paper. So how did they find this one? There's no explanation in the paper.
In other words, it looks like they just immediately jumped to that one.
Yeah.
Instead of actually doing research, they just immediately jumped to that one. What would the normal protocol be in most cases? You mentioned a bit of that, but can you explain that to us?
Yeah, for normally, right? For example, if my lab have 100 bad coronavirus, some of them may be already sequenced, some of them haven't, right? So under this crisis, under this outbreak, right, I probably put out the effort. I make sure all the bad coronavirus in my pool, in my collection, I do full genome sequencing for all of them. Right, so and then I compare it to the SARS-CoV-2, and then maybe identify top one, maybe the IITG one with 96%. Then I will find other showing maybe 90, 92 or 87% homology. So you will see efforts to describing your screening your pool, your collections, and then you will see different virus showing different homology. But in this paper, there's no such a description. It's just like suddenly I know there's a bad coronavirus IITG13, it has 96%, and there's no description about how this virus was isolated in Yunnan, which particular bad species was related. Any previous study on this one, there's no publication about this one. So that's why the emerging of this new or may not be new, but the emerging of this RATG13 to the scientific community, it's a surprise. So if any chance, any independent investigation went to Wuhan Institute of Virology, I think they need to look at it, let know when did the virus got collected, when was it fully sequenced, and how did you know this one was really related to SARS-CoV-2 while others not any related research efforts, right? Of course, scientific paper may not publish every effort I did, but usually you will describe. It's a major effort. It's not a like minor things, right? You can describe about it. So I think that this part need to be investigated.
Yeah, very interesting. Any other anomalies you've seen?
Also, another important observation is regarding about the pangolin COVID. So on February 7th, two scientists from South China Agricultural University, this is Shen Yongyi and Xiao Lihua, these two scientists, they actually held a press conference in Guangzhou, telling the public they identified pangolin coronavirus showing 99% homology with SARS-CoV-2. It was a surprising big event at the time because so many media in China reported, because everybody's trying to find out about the animal reservoir for this SARS-CoV-2, and when they showing evidence say this is 99% homology, everybody was surprised. Everybody thought and they identified a pangolin as a intermediate animal reservoir for SARS-CoV-2. When later on, when other media tried to follow up story on their claims, they said that they didn't collect the samples. They are not the one collecting samples. They mentioned someone providing them these samples, but they didn't mention which agency providing this sample to them, which institute provided to them, right? So it's a mysterious one. Everybody will try to wait for their own further publication. You need a scientific publication to follow up, to back up your claim, and there's no report so far. And very interesting, when I track back to this scientist, Dr. Shen Yongyi's publication, I found he has a publication on April 8th. This time it's a very brief communication on Journal of Infections. So in this brief communication, he mentioned pangolin coronavirus homology to the SARS-CoV-2 is only about 85.5% to 96.2% homology. So it's very different from 99.6% homology that he first claimed. So where did those pangolin samples go? So does that mean his original claim is totally wrong? So this definitely put a question regarding about pangolin COVID is a immediate animal reservoir for SARS-CoV-2. And we know that Dr. Guang Yi from Hong Kong University later in March did publish a very credible science report regarding the pangolin COVID. But their pangolin sample was actually collected in the 2017 to 2018 anti-smuggling campaigns. So that means those pangolin samples is probably not directly related to this outbreak of COVID-19 this time, because it's 1 or 2 years earlier. Even though those pangolin CoVs was identified to show relatively higher homologies compared to many of the bad coronavirus, but it's not 96% as well. And so it's very hard to understand the origin of this SARS-CoV-2. So it's probably, people suspect it may be bad, maybe pangolin, but it cannot be simply explained by simple evolutions. It cannot be simply explained by recombination as well. For example, in the S protein of the SARS-CoV-2, the S proteins overall showing high homology to the bad coronavirus, the RATG13. But very interesting, the receptor binding domain, it actually have very unique features that identical to the pangolin COVID, right? The 5 key amino acids that are responsible for binding to the human receptor ACE2, they are actually identical to the pangolin COVID. But the overall S protein is showing high homology to the bad coronavirus RATG13. And that's why I said that this RATG13 is so unique, so strange. It's need to understand where they come from. And also, both pangolin COVID and also the RATG13, the bad coronavirus, do not have the furin cleavage site for the S protein. But this is a very, very important feature, because once you have the furin cleavage site, the virus fusiogenicity is in kind of like jumped several fold higher. It's a very important mutation. So all these cannot be simply explained by regular evolutions or even recombination event, and probably suggesting either bat or pangolin, they are not the immediate animal reservoir for this SARS-CoV-2 outbreak. So these are still need a scientific community to investigate, and I also want to emphasize people need to understand more about the RATG13. When did this bad coronavirus emerge in nature, or how did it happen to have only one simple description in a Nature paper, such an important Nature paper, talk about the origin of the SARS-CoV-2, right? So This is just emphasizing the world needs a lot more investigation, in-depth investigation into Wuhan Institute of Virology.
So yeah, Sean, I mean, this is important points. Even in normal scientific research, this would of course show some serious gaps in terms of the information being presented to us. You know, not to mention now where it's a global pandemic and something everybody's facing, and we're looking to them for answers on this. I guess, how would you sum this up? If you were to break this all down, what do you hope people take away from this?
I think the first key point to take home is the Wuhan Institute of Virology is most likely covering up when did they first receive the patient samples. These need to be thoroughly investigated. And then the second part, the whole scientific community need to further investigate where did the RATG13 bat coronavirus strain appeared in the Institute of Virology. What kind of previous research was done on this strain? Any further characterization of these bat coronavirus? These are very important issues to understand. At least only one strain of bat coronavirus emerged. The world also need to investigate regarding about the pangolin sample the South China Agricultural University received in February. You know, when they claimed they find 99% homology of pangolin COVID. So where did that sample go? It need to be further tested, further confirmed. Right? It will be very important animals. This is regarding the animal source of this coronavirus. So I think these three parts, the world need a thorough understanding.
Yeah, Sean, really appreciate it. Yeah, pretty serious things, I think, to look into. There's great findings also.
Oh, you're welcome. Welcome.
Yeah, we'll have to get you on again sometime. You can explain these things to us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Great. Have a good day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Now, of course, we covered some pretty intense topics on this show, at least especially now because of this virus. And a lot of you have been asking what you can do given this situation. The Epoch Times has launched a global petition calling for the investigation, rejection, and condemnation of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, we believe that investigating and exposing the truth on this virus and on the Chinese regime's involvement in it is the only way that the world can remain safe. And of course, the Chinese regime has been attacking anyone, including entire countries, who have called for these investigations. And so we're asking the world now, giving them the petition for it, to let their voices be heard and take a stand themselves. So go to ccpvirustruth.com, take a stand, let them know what you think. And also, please, folks, help us get this out there. Help us spread the word on this. That's ccpvirustruth.com. Go there and sign the petition. Also, folks, if you want to help this channel, we do accept donations. I mean, a lot of you have been donating. Really appreciate it. You know, it really does mean a lot to us. Please do like and subscribe, and also tell your friends and family about this show. I think we have some good information here. Hopefully you agree with me, and of course I'm going to be working hard to continue bringing unique analysis and unique information when it comes to this virus, trying to look into things others may be missing. That said, folks, again, we'll be broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, so don't forget to tune in. And with that said, folks, please stay safe, take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time.